Sometimes history pivots on a single moment, a single speech, even. Imagine a moment that sends a shockwave through an entire global ideology. Well, in February 1956, one man stood up in front of the most powerful people in the Soviet Communist Party, and he did the unthinkable. He started to tear down the myth of his own predecessor, Joseph Stalin. What he said that day, in a closed session, would leak out and completely change the course of the Cold War, planting the seeds of the Soviet Union's eventual collapse. This is the story of how a single speech cracked the very foundation of an empire.
And that right there brings us to the central, massive paradox of this whole story. And it's all wrapped up in one man, Nikita Khrushchev. I mean, this guy was a loyal Stalinist. He climbed the ranks by carrying out Stalin's most brutal policies. And yet, he was the one who took the incredible risk of denouncing the very system of terror that made him. It's an incredible gamble, and that's what we're going to break down.
So to really understand the speech, you have to rewind the clock 3 years to March 1953. Joseph Stalin is dead, and in the halls of the Kremlin, the feeling isn't relief, it's pure, uncut terror. Stalin never named a successor, so he left behind this giant power vacuum. His inner circle, the men who ran the country with him, were suddenly adrift. They were in a dictatorship that had no dictator.
Stalin's successors found themselves in this impossible trap. They knew, for a fact, that if one of them managed to become a new Stalin, the rest of them would be the first ones up against the wall. They also realized that you can't really rule a country through mass terror forever. It just wasn't sustainable. But that left them with these terrifying questions. How do you keep absolute control without the terror? And maybe even more dangerous, how do you stop it from happening again without admitting to the horrifying scale of the crimes you yourself helped commit?
And into this total chaos steps our protagonist, and he is a very unlikely one. Nikita Khrushchev was, well, he was a character. Flamboyant, temperamental, often written off by his rivals as some kind of crude, unsophisticated peasant. I mean, this was a guy from a poor family who hitched his entire career to Stalin's star and became a loyal, and let's be clear, ruthless enforcer of his policies. He really seemed like the last person on earth who would try to dismantle the master's house.
But here's the thing about Khrushchev. He was a master of political maneuvering. In that brutal power struggle right after Stalin died, he just systematically outplayed everyone. First, he pulls off a Kremlin coup to get the feared secret police chief Lavrenti Beria arrested and executed. Done. Then he goes after his other main rival, Malenkov, and gets him demoted in 1955. And just like that, by 1956, Khrushchev emerges as the undisputed top dog of the Soviet Union.
And this chart just lays out the wild contradiction perfectly. On one side, you've got Khrushchev, the loyal Stalinist, a man with blood on his hands, personally responsible for arresting 250,000 people in Ukraine alone. But on the other side, you get Khrushchev the reformer, the guy who ends that same reign of terror and starts talking about peaceful coexistence. This wasn't just hypocrisy, it was the entire system's dilemma in one man. He was both the perpetrator and the prosecutor, a product of the very terror he now had to control. Okay, so all of this builds to one single pivotal moment. February 25th, 1956. We're at the 20th Party Congress in Moscow. The official business is all wrapped up, but the delegates are told to stay put for one last closed session. No press, no guests, no notes allowed. What's about to happen won't actually be published in the Soviet Union for more than 30 years.
For 4 straight hours, Khrushchev just unloads. He delivers this blistering takedown of the man who was once worshipped like a god. Can you imagine being in that room? He detailed Stalin's brutal, paranoid rule to a completely stunned audience of party officials, many of whom, by the way, were his accomplices.
So what did he actually say? Well, he went after the whole cult of personality that had put Stalin above the party itself. He detailed Stalin's brutal purges, but he focused specifically on the loyal communists and military leaders who were killed. He even called out his foreign policy mistakes, like the break with Yugoslavia and his absolutely catastrophic failure to prepare the country for the Nazi invasion in World War II.
But this is so important, what he didn't say is just as telling. This speech was a very limited, very calculated confession. Khrushchev focused almost entirely on Stalin's crimes against the party elite. He said absolutely nothing about the worst atrocities against the regular population, like the De-Stalinisation, that violent war on millions of peasants, or the engineered famines that killed millions more. The message was clear, and it was targeted. Stalin was bad because he hurt us, the party, not because the communist system itself was criminal. That speech, even though it was secret, was basically the starting gun for a whole new era in Soviet policy. It kicked off a process that came to be known as De-Stalinisation, a massive effort to pull the Soviet Union away from the horrors of the past few decades.
So, what exactly was de-Stalinization? Well, you can think of it as a formal, top-down attempt to reform the system without actually destroying it. The whole goal was to criticize Stalin's methods, especially his use of terror, while keeping the party's absolute power intact. It also meant shifting the country's focus away from just heavy industry to, finally improving the lives of ordinary people.
And in practice, it looked like this. Step 1, and this was the big one, end mass terror. The secret police, now called the KGB, was brought firmly under party control so it could never again terrorize the leadership. Step 2, release the prisoners. Millions of political prisoners were let out of the Gulag labor camps. And Step 3, on the world stage, Khrushchev started pushing this idea of peaceful coexistence, arguing that a war between communism and capitalism wasn't inevitable anymore.
But here's the thing. You can't just open Pandora's box a little bit. The genie was out of the bottle. Word of the speech spread like wildfire, first through Eastern Europe and then to the West, and the consequences were immediate, they were profound, and they were irreversible. The whole system was shaken to its core.
This quote just nails it. The Communist Party's authority, its entire claim to power, rested on this idea that it was a unique, infallible source of truth. It was always right. By admitting that the guy in charge for 30 years was a paranoid, criminal blunderer, Khrushchev completely shattered that image. It created this deep, lasting crisis of belief that the system, honestly, never really recovered from.
The aftershocks were felt everywhere. The speech fired up reformers in places like Hungary and Poland who started to test the limits of Soviet control, often with tragic results. But inside the USSR, it inspired a whole new generation of intellectuals and future leaders. They were called the Shekstisyatny, or people of the 60s, a generation whose whole worldview was shaped by this moment, and it gave them the courage to start questioning the system from the inside.
And incredibly, among that very generation was a young law graduate from Moscow University, a man whose own ideas about reforming socialism were first planted by Khrushchev's de-Stalinization. And yeah, his name was Mikhail Gorbachev. The long, slow-burning fuse that was lit by that secret speech in 1956 would eventually lead to the man who would oversee the final end of the Soviet Union.
Which really just leaves us with this one big question. Khrushchev tried to control it, right? He tried to limit the blame, to save the system. But what his secret speech really showed was a powerful truth. Once a regime that's built on being perfect admits to its own massive, horrifying crimes, can it ever really get back the total authority it once had? Something to think about.